let's let's have some fun here and talk about the the importance of separating what you see at work from like home and day-to-day life. So directly towards science because you're the star today. Has there ever been a time where you looked at a case or a case file and you're like, well, I can't have lunch today, and like because they just turned you off so badly?
Thank God I haven't had such a case. I mean, probably, relative to other people who don't work in the field, I've done a lot of, things that people probably would think, like absolutely nasty. But, I love the work that I do. A big part of what I did when I was working in forensic science in St. Kitts was going to autopsies of persons who had died unnatural deaths. Some persons we actually found died natural deaths as well, but mostly in terms of death related to crime or suspected criminal activity.
Mm.
Done a lot of autopsies, probably over 50 autopsies so far in my career. And the human body, I don't think it was meant for us to look at other humans in that way, when you're on the autopsy table. It's definitely not natural to do, everything, the sight of it, the smell of it, the sounds, the textures, because definitely involved some touching, a lot of weird stuff that I've done, in the name of forensic science, and something that I've been able to compartmentalize, and I don't think that's a very good thing. It's good in the sense that I've never ever brought it home. I've never ever tried to come home and be like, yeah, man, Akila, who is my wife. Akila, you know what I saw today? I never ever did that. I never ever did that.
Mm,
You know, which is good. Didn't
yeah.
burden anybody in my family with the foolishness that has happened in terms of investigating crimes and the, like heinous things that people have done. But it's also bad in terms of, never really had an outlet for it at the time. So, major impacts, on how you relate to people and your own mental health. But in terms of like funny stuff that I've seen, like I remember one case was a woman was just, found dead in her house. You know,
Mm.
like people were checking up on her, couldn't actually get into the house, but were able to see that she was just lying on the ground, not moving. Like so, the police were able to break into the door, and they called us crime scene investigators. And one of my colleague, as soon as that door broke open, he was like, "You smell it? You smell it? Somebody dead." And it's like, those things really happen, and it's like, you start to get accustomed to the smell of death, and like that colleague was somebody who was like he had that nose, like he could like differentiate between animal, human, domesticated animal, wild animal. Like he had the nose. Like that really happened, and he could bring that up anytime he wanted.
Oh,
But in terms of us not really taking it home, like there were times when really really bad things happened. And like we basically had that code of silence, like outside of the office, we're not talking about this. Like it was really just an unwritten thing. We would never really go to any bars, and like all of a sudden just be talking about cases and those things, the images that we've seen, scents that we've smelled. So thankfully, you know, we're able to do that, and I think it's really important to not burden other people with these things, but it's also important to have some way, to let it out. Somebody else who you could talk to or discuss it with. Just so you keep your humanity.
Who have you joined like a group or something like that, like of your peers or something? How did you get out? How did you get it out eventually?
Well, I'm definitely not a good example for that. I'm somebody who I've I've hardly ever talked about these things, and I do think that it has some impact on me. Like I was before I started working as a crime scene investigator, I was never really a heavy sleeper. But since that time, I do not sleep well. I'm a very light sleeper. Anything could wake me up. And I go to sleep late, wake up late. it has had impacts on my life. So I'm not a good example of what you should do. I haven't joined any groups. Haven't been to therapy.
Mm.
And these are things that I would definitely consider. But sometimes I feel like the pressures of even life at home, as a stay-at-home dad, sometimes get in the way of that kind of time.
Mm. That's deep. What about you, Mino? How's your job and work home balance?
So when I was working in injury, a lot of times we had cases where uh, people would self delete, and reading. Sometimes we had. Like, I remember one case we had to read through to categorize them into different categories as we were trying to create the data set.
Mm.
And I had to read a lot of cases of how they self deleted, what happened before they self deleted, and all these other things, and even some case of domestic abuse or so I think I read one homicide, but just reading those things, just reading it, and there's a lot of details in there. That had a big effect on me. I don't think I ever told anyone about that. I think just like science, I didn't think that was something that I would tell to anyone at home because I didn't want to affect their mental health along with my own. But I would say, generally speaking, in my field, there's no real separation because a lot of times it is something interesting to me, at least, where I want to share it with someone because I think they'll be interested too, especially since my wife is a scientist as well.
Mm.
So because we both like science, we both like talking about the topics and kind of like, oh, you know what I learned today? I learned that BMI doesn't have a bigger effect on mm, injury as I thought. You know, it's actually BMI has a less effect because maybe they're running slower because they're bigger or whatever. We think we might talk through like why it could be that way or something like that. So sometimes I do bring it home. I can be very specific because of different reasons such as HIPAA and all that kind of stuff. But just talking about the generalities of what I do is sometimes interesting. I wouldn't say I do it often, but I do sometimes do it. I think the hard part about separating work from home is that since I'm working from home now, sometimes I work for fun because I do enjoy coding. I do enjoy database management and stuff like that. So sometimes I'm up at 3 a.m. coding when I should have stopped working like 4 hours ago. So stuff like that is kind of hard now that I'm teleworking.
Mm.
But besides that, it's not that hard.
Well, for me, I work in public works on the streets division, so it's harder for me to separate it because if I'm driving through a city and I see a stop sign not at the right height, I'm like, that stop sign's wrong. We could just blow through it and they won't give us a ticket. Or there's lots of potholes here, or the street signs look funny. Like, it's always coming. So I have to like just turn it off completely and go back to the time before I knew any of the information or any of the data here. Because everything that I see that happens on the road, it has to do with work. So I just know of these things. I mean, even my wife calls me like, "Hey, there's a stop sign here. It looks funny." Because now she's taking it too, because that's how we are. So now I have to go and deal with that. But the part that I try the best to leave at work is like dealing with administration and dealing with the customers who call complaining over and over and over again. It's like we're trying to help, but there's only so much we can do in a day. And I think I have to just leave those conversations at work and just deal with what I can deal with and just talk about changing some stop sign here or being 30 feet in the air, fixing a light or something. Just talk about the fun stuff.
Yes, I was good to talk about the fun stuff. And when Science was telling his story that we all laughed at, I kind of felt bad a little bit because I was like, we laughing at from somebody dead, but at the same time, it was a funny story. I hope nobody in the audience got offended because we do live in a culture nowadays where people take things a lot more seriously. So, audience members, if you are out there and you didn't find it funny, we apologize ahead of time. But it was a funny story. I can't imagine having a friend or a colleague like that who is like, oh, you smell that? That's what it is. Like I can imagine it in real life. I could sometimes even imagine me being that friend. Actually,
Oh
I
man.
imagine if me and Wanted were crime scene investigators, I would be that friend. So yeah, I kind of related a little bit too.
So science, as I talked about before, there's many, many shows that, highlight forensic science. I remember you saying you don't really watch them, but I wanted to ask a question on like, what's the most realistic one? And are forensic scientists the up and coming rock stars of pathology?
Well, the most realistic forensic science show, I would say none of them are realistic.
Mm,
There's always things that, you know, are hyped up for entertainment value on these shows. So, like a lot of stuff that you see, things happening really quickly, that doesn't happen in real life forensic science. Like you get called to a scene, you have to actually put on what's called personal protective equipment, and that doesn't look as flashy as one forensic scientist who is a woman actually. I remember in her presentation she said, you'll never see cleavage on a crime scene. You see that on TV.
mhm,
And I mean, the truth is, like, nobody has any exposed skin on a sensitive crime scene, you know, for a fact. But the forensic science show that I enjoy the most was the original CSI. I don't watch it now, and I was telling you guys, that there's gonna be a reunion
mhm,
of the guy who was the original team leader on that, a character called Gil Grissom.
yeah.
And Gil Grissom, he's actually somebody who had a PhD in biology. Like purely, his character bio is awesome.
Mhm,
He had a PhD in biology. He was actually working with insects from since he was in high school. He became an entomologist, just based on his training around insects. And then, just applied for this job to be a CSI because he thought, might as well, you know. Actually got it and fell in love with it. And he's actually, one of those characters who's become really lovable for, just being a normal person outside of the lab, but inside of the lab, somebody very technically proficient. And, on the crime scene, excellent example of a CSI in terms of, being detail oriented, trying to make sure that the right procedures are followed. Like that's something that, we try and do in the field as well. But, a lot of other aspects of the character definitely just more fiction than anything else.
mhm,
But, definitely a favorite of people in the community. Like real crime scene investigators look up to Gil Grissom. And he was a team leader who was somebody who was, not at all toxic with his team. And in real life, we deal with toxic team leaders all the time. Can't tell you, like people who would work you to the bone for no reason other than to please people who are above them. So yeah, we deal with a lot of those things as well. But I have fun watching some shows. I used to watch Bones for a while as well. I liked that. Um, no other, yeah, no other show really that I liked in the fictional aspect.